Some people don't come to reunions to remember the past, they come to rewrite it. Jason Miller lifted his glass beneath the crystal chandelier of the Hilton ballroom, the light catching the silver at his temples just enough to make him look distinguished instead of aging, and the room leaned toward him the way rooms always did when confidence filled the air. 15 years after graduation, the banners in navy and gold draped across the walls, a slideshow of yearbook photos looping behind him, and at the center of it all, he stood with the microphone like he owned not just the company he worked for but the narrative of everyone in it, and then he smiled that familiar smile and said, "You all remember Emily Carter, right? My ex-wife. Sweet girl. Just not built for the pressure." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, polite at first, then warmer as he continued, talking about long nights, ambition, how success demands resilience, how not everyone can handle the climb, carefully shaping the story so it sounded like encouragement when it was really erasure. And across the room near the bar lined with polished glass and bottles of top-shelf bourbon, Emily stood alone in a navy silk dress that fell just below her knees. Simple, tailored, nothing flashy, her blonde hair pulled back in a low knot, posture straight, shoulders relaxed, a single diamond stud catching the light when she turned her head. She had arrived 10 minutes earlier in a quiet black sedan, stepped out without hesitation, walked past clusters of former classmates who blinked twice before recognizing her, and now she listened without interrupting, without flinching, as Jason painted a version of their marriage that left out the part where she stayed up proofreading his pitch decks, the part where she covered rent when his startup account ran low, the part where she believed in him before anyone else did. The slideshow behind him shifted to a photo from senior year, Jason's arm around her waist, both of them laughing under autumn trees, and someone near the front whispered, "I didn't know they divorced," and someone else murmured, "Guess she couldn't keep up," and the words floated through the room like soft confetti, harmless on the surface, cutting underneath. Emily set her sparkling water down on the marble counter with deliberate calm, the condensation cool against her fingertips, and for a moment the music from the hired DJ softened, replaced by the hum of conversation and the faint clink of ice in glasses, and Jason, sensing the attention, added one more line with a grin, "But hey, we all grow up, don't we?" The crowd chuckled again, and he raised his glass higher, basking in the affirmation, while Emily simply watched him, her expression unreadable, not wounded, not angry, just composed, as if she were observing a presentation rather than being presented as a punchline. And if anyone had looked closely, they would have noticed that her hands were steady, her breathing even, her gaze clear, because she had not come here to defend the past. She had come to witness something else entirely, something that had not yet entered the room but was already on its way. And as Jason's laughter faded into applause and the ballroom lights dimmed slightly for the next announcement, Emily Carter did not move toward the exit, did not interrupt, did not correct him. She stayed exactly where she was, calm as a shoreline before the tide turns, waiting. The applause lingered a few seconds longer than it deserved, then dissolved into scattered conversations and the soft shuffle of dress shoes across carpet, and Jason handed the microphone back to the event coordinator with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the room still belonged to him. He stepped down from the small stage and was immediately surrounded by former classmates in tailored suits and cocktail dresses, hands clapping his shoulder, voices praising his success, asking about market trends, promotions, the kind of questions reserved for someone perceived as winning, and from across the ballroom Emily watched the circle form around him like orbiting satellites, her reflection faintly visible in the mirrored wall behind the bar as if she were observing both the present and a distant memory at the same time. Someone approached her then, a woman from their graduating class named Lauren who had once borrowed her calculus notes, offering a careful smile and a half whisper, saying she was sorry things did not work out, saying she had always thought Emily was too gentle for someone as driven as Jason, and Emily nodded politely, not correcting her, not explaining that gentleness and strength were never opposites, just different languages. And as Lauren drifted away the music shifted into a nostalgic song from senior year, prompting laughter and a few brave couples onto the dance floor. Jason glanced toward Emily for the first time since his speech, and their eyes met across 30 feet of polished wooden moving bodies, his expression flickering with something almost like surprise that she had not left, as if endurance itself unsettled him more than any argument could have. And he excused himself from his circle and walked toward her with measured steps, straightening his jacket. As he approached, stopping just close enough to appear cordial but not intimate, saying, "I did not think you would actually show up," his tone light, almost amused, and she replied evenly that the invitation had been addressed to both of them, Her voice calm, steady, neither cold nor warm, simply factual. He studied her for a moment, noticing the quiet confidence in her posture, the absence of defensiveness in her gaze, and perhaps searching for a crack that was not there. Then he gestured toward the crowd and said that everyone loves a good comeback story, implying without stating that she had once been a footnote in his, and Emily listened without reacting, because she understood something he did not yet sense, that narratives built on omission eventually reveal their own emptiness. Around them the reunion buzzed with nostalgia, old trophies displayed in glass cases along the wall, a banner announcing a scholarship fund supported by anonymous donors, waiters weaving through with trays of sparkling water and champagne, and through the tall windows the city lights shimmered against the dark sky like distant promises. Jason cleared his throat as if to say more, but instead he offered a small shrug and said he hoped she was doing well, the kind of phrase that sounds generous but carries the weight of condescension, and she answered that she was exactly where she needed to be, a sentence so simple it left no room for debate. And as he turned his head briefly toward the entrance of the ballroom, distracted by the sound of the outer doors opening and a subtle shift in the room's attention, Emily followed the movement with quiet awareness, not anticipation, not anxiety, just the steady composure of someone who understands that timing, unlike reputation, does not need applause to matter. The outer doors did not slam or creak, they opened with the quiet authority of brushed steel hinges, and the subtle shift in air was enough to draw a few glances from the nearest tables before the attention began to travel, slow and curious, toward the entrance. Jason followed the movement instinctively, his sentence trailing off mid-thought, and Emily watched him notice what she had already sensed, that the atmosphere had tilted by a single, almost imperceptible degree. A tall man stepped inside, removing dark leather gloves with unhurried precision, his charcoal suit tailored with the kind of restraint that did not beg for recognition yet carried it naturally, his presence calm, composed, neither hurried nor hesitant, and he paused briefly to greet the event coordinator who suddenly straightened as if aware that the evening had just acquired new gravity. A few alumni near the door exchanged whispers, one of them murmuring a name in disbelief, another quickly checking a phone as though to confirm what intuition had already suggested, and across the ballroom Jason narrowed his eyes slightly, the faint crease between his brows betraying a flicker of recognition he could not immediately place. The music continued, but softer now, drowned beneath the growing undercurrent of curiosity, and Emily did not turn fully toward the entrance. She simply adjusted the delicate bracelet at her wrist and allowed herself a small, steady breath, the kind taken by someone who has already rehearsed patience for years. The man began walking across the room, not scanning the crowd for approval, not performing, just moving with quiet purpose, and as he passed a cluster of former classmates one of them greeted him by name, addressing him as Mr. Hayes with a respect that sounded less like formality and more like acknowledgement. Jason's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, shoulders tightening beneath his jacket, his confidence recalibrating as memory began to connect fragments, industry headlines, acquisition rumors, the recent announcement about a capital firm expanding into regional tech investments, and Emily could see the calculation forming behind his eyes, that subtle mental arithmetic men like him perform when power dynamics start to rearrange. The scholarship banner near the stage caught the light, and a board member approached the man with a handshake and an enthusiastic nod, thanking him publicly for underwriting the entire reunion event through his foundation. And the words carried just far enough across the ballroom for Jason to hear them clearly. Alexander Hayes Capital, spoken without emphasis, yet impossible to ignore. Conversation shifted tone instantly, laughter lowering into attentive murmurs, as if the room itself had decided to adjust its hierarchy, and through it all Emily remained still, not stepping forward, not signaling, simply present, her composure unaltered, because she understood something Jason was only beginning to grasp, that influence does not announce itself loudly, it enters, observes, and settles into place. Alexander's gaze moved across the room with calm awareness until it found her, and in that brief, unspoken exchange there was no surprise, only recognition, as though the distance between them had never been measured in feet but in timing, and Jason, standing only a few steps away from Emily, felt the unmistakable weight of a story shifting beyond his control, the narrative he had crafted minutes earlier thinning like smoke in bright light, while the evening, once predictable and nostalgic, began quietly rewriting itself without a single raised voice. For a moment the distance between them felt measured not in steps but in history, and Alexander Hayes did not hurry as he crossed the ballroom floor, his pace steady, deliberate, the kind of walk that suggested he answered to no one's timeline but his own. conversations continued to soften in his wake, and the board member who had greeted him remained half a step behind as if instinctively aware of the invisible perimeter that surrounded influence. Jason adjusted his cufflinks, a reflex he had not used in years, and forced a smile that hovered somewhere between recognition and calculation, because he now remembered the articles, the interviews on financial networks, the acquisition that had restructured half the regional tech market within 12 months, and he understood exactly who had just entered the room. Emily remained beside the bar, posture aligned, chin slightly lifted, not moving toward Alexander yet not retreating either, and when he reached conversational distance he did not extend his hand immediately, did not announce himself. He simply inclined his head toward her with quiet warmth and said, "I was hoping you made it," his voice even, composed, familiar without being intimate, and the subtle shift in tone was enough for Jason to feel the air tighten. Jason stepped forward with a measured politeness and introduced himself, offering a firm handshake, stating his position at his company with the confidence of a man accustomed to credentials carrying weight, and Alexander listened attentively, nodding once, replying that he had followed the firm's recent developments with interest, a statement that was neither praise nor dismissal but something far more disarming, because it implied awareness. A few nearby alumni edged closer under the pretense of greeting one another, their curiosity no longer disguised, and the event coordinator returned to the microphone near the stage to thank once more the anonymous donor whose foundation had funded the entire evening, announcing that the endowment for the new scholarship wing would also bear the Hayes name, and the applause that followed felt different from the earlier laughter, deeper, steadier, rooted in respect rather than amusement. Jason's earlier jokes about pressure and resilience seemed to fade into the background noise of clinking glasses and low music, and for the first time that evening he appeared unsure where to place his hands, whether to stand beside Emily or slightly apart from her. Alexander finally extended his hand toward her, not as introduction but as quiet acknowledgement, and she accepted it with the ease of someone accustomed to partnership rather than display, their fingers interlacing naturally, unforced, and the gesture required no explanation. Jason's gaze dropped briefly to their joined hands before lifting again, and in that single second the balance of the room recalibrated completely, not because anyone announced it, but because perception had shifted. Emily did not look at Jason for validation, nor for triumph. She looked ahead, meeting the eyes of former classmates who now regarded her with a different understanding, and when Alexander asked softly whether she was ready to greet the dean before the next announcement, she nodded once, serene, as though this had always been the evening's true purpose. Together they moved toward the stage, not hurried, not theatrical, simply aligned, and behind them Jason remained standing beneath the chandelier's pale light, the echo of his earlier confidence thinning against the quiet certainty of something he could neither interrupt nor control. The dean welcomed them near the edge of the stage with visible gratitude, shaking Alexander's hand firmly before turning to Emily with a warmth that suggested recognition beyond courtesy, and as they stepped into the soft wash of overhead lights the ballroom seemed to quiet in anticipation rather than obligation. The microphone was offered, but Alexander declined it with a gentle motion, indicating that the evening was not about speeches, and instead the dean spoke briefly about opportunity, about how certain contributions do more than fund buildings, they fund belief, and he gestured toward Emily as he mentioned the advisory role she had played in structuring the scholarship trust, a detail that moved through the room like a low current. Jason, still positioned beneath the chandelier, felt the shift land more heavily this time, because it reframed the narrative entirely, not as a dramatic entrance but as a sustained partnership that had existed long before tonight's applause. Emily stood poised beside Alexander, hands relaxed at her sides, listening without interruption, and when the dean thanked her specifically for insisting that the endowment prioritize first-generation college students, several alumni nodded with new understanding, recalling perhaps fragments of her character they had overlooked years ago. The music resumed softly once the acknowledgement ended, and conversations reignited with a different energy, less nostalgic, more reflective. As people recalibrated their assumptions in real time, Jason approached the edge of the gathering once more, this time without the earlier swagger, offering congratulations that sounded measured, almost careful, and Emily received his words with the same composure she had maintained all evening, thanking him sincerely, because grace does not require irony. Alexander observed the exchange without intrusion, his presence steady rather than possessive, and when Jason mentioned the Recent volatility in the tech market, hinting at competitive resilience. Alexander responded calmly that sustainable growth often depends less on visibility and more on structure, a statement delivered without accusation yet precise enough to linger. Nearby, a former classmate whispered that the Hayes firm had recently acquired majority interest in several mid-sized companies across the state, and Jason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as connections formed that he would rather have delayed. Emily sensed the undercurrent but did not exploit it, because her purpose had never been to corner him publicly, only to stand unshaken where she once might have felt diminished. A photographer from the Alumni Association requested a group picture of major donors and distinguished graduates, and as they assembled beneath the reunion banner, the arrangement placed Emily and Alexander naturally at the center, not by design but by relevance, while Jason found himself half a step to the side, smiling for the camera with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to leading, yet aware that leadership can quietly migrate. The flash captured more than faces, it captured a reordering, subtle yet undeniable, and when the photographer thanked them and the group dispersed, Alexander leaned toward Emily just enough to ask whether she would like some fresh air on the terrace overlooking the city, and she agreed, not because she needed escape, but because the night had already delivered what it came to deliver. And as they walked toward the glass doors together, the reflection of the ballroom lights fading behind them, the room they left continued humming, but the axis around which it turned had shifted completely. The terrace doors closed softly behind them, muting the hum of the ballroom into a distant blend of music and conversation, and the cool evening air carried the faint scent of rain even though the forecast had promised clear skies. From 30 floors above the city, the skyline stretched in deliberate lines of light, headlights threading along highways like quiet currents, office towers glowing in scattered windows where someone was still working late, and Emily stepped toward the glass railing. With measured calm, resting her fingertips lightly against the smooth surface as she took in the view, Alexander stood beside her without speaking at first, allowing the silence to settle into something steady rather than strained, and below them the city moved forward indifferent to reunions and reputations. After a moment he asked whether she was all right, not because he doubted her strength but because partnership begins with listening, and she nodded, her gaze remaining on the horizon as she answered that she had expected nothing less from tonight, that some people remain loyal to the stories they tell even when the truth has long since outgrown them. He watched her profile in the reflected glow of the city lights, seeing not the woman who had once been described as unable to handle pressure but the strategist who had quietly helped structure investment frameworks that reshaped entire markets, and he said softly that composure is often mistaken for weakness by those who rely on volume. She smiled faintly at that, not in triumph but in recognition, remembering a different evening years earlier when she had packed 2 suitcases into the trunk of her compact sedan, driven 300 miles to a smaller apartment with rent she could barely afford at the time, and chosen silence over spectacle, because dignity had felt more valuable than argument. She told him she had not returned tonight for closure, nor for validation, but to prove something to herself, that standing in the same room no longer carried the same weight. And as she spoke the glass doors behind them opened briefly with a rush of warmer air, revealing Jason's silhouette hesitating just inside the threshold before retreating back into the ballroom. Alexander did not comment on it, but he noticed, and instead he asked whether she wanted to stay longer or leave early, making it clear that either choice belonged to her. She considered the question, watching a pair of airplanes blink across the dark sky at steady intervals, then replied that a few more minutes would be enough, because the night had shifted exactly as it needed to, without confrontation, without raised voices, only through presence. Inside, laughter rose again, but it sounded different now, less pointed, more uncertain. And on the terrace the wind moved gently through her hair as she turned toward Alexander and thanked him for arriving when he did, not for spectacle, but for timing. He answered that he had never intended to rescue her, only to stand beside her, and in that distinction lay the quiet architecture of everything they had built together, not in headlines or applause, but in steady decisions made long before anyone else was watching. When they stepped back inside, the ballroom felt smaller, as if the ceiling had lowered by a few inches, and conversations paused just long enough to acknowledge their return before resuming with careful neutrality. The music shifted into a slower instrumental piece, and clusters of alumni stood in small circles, speaking in tones that suggested recalibration rather than celebration. Emily walked beside Alexander without clutching his arm, her stride even, her expression serene, and the path before them opened not dramatically but gradually, As people adjusted their positions with subtle deference, near the center of the room Jason stood speaking with two former classmates from the finance club, his gestures animated but his eyes distracted, scanning the space with a restlessness that had not been there earlier, and when he noticed Emily and Alexander approaching, his posture straightened instinctively. As if bracing for a conversation he had not rehearsed, one of the classmates greeted Alexander first, introducing himself with enthusiasm and mentioning an article about a recent acquisition that had stabilized several struggling firms in the region, and Alexander responded with measured courtesy, deflecting praise toward the teams who executed the strategy, while Emily listened quietly, aware that the narrative was unfolding without her intervention. Jason waited for a pause before stepping forward, his smile practiced yet thinner than before, and he addressed Alexander by name this time, acknowledging that their firms had crossed paths indirectly through market movements. His tone suggesting competition masked as professionalism. Alexander inclined his head slightly and replied that market ecosystems are interconnected, that responsible leadership benefits everyone involved, and the simplicity of his answer left little room for posturing. A faint silence settled between the three of them, not hostile but charged with awareness, and Jason shifted his weight before saying that he had always believed resilience defined success, casting the statement as a universal truth while glancing briefly at Emily, as if inviting her to contest it. She met his gaze calmly and said that resilience also includes knowing when to let go of what no longer aligns with who you are becoming, her voice steady, unhurried, and the words landed without accusation, carrying more weight than any rebuttal could have. The classmates exchanged subtle looks, sensing that something unspoken had just been clarified, and across the room the dean began announcing the final toast of the evening, inviting everyone to raise a glass to growth, to second chances, to the unexpected paths that lead people exactly where they need to be. The glass is lifted, crystal catching light beneath the chandelier, and in that collective gesture Jason found himself slightly outside the center of the circle he had once commanded, while Emily stood grounded, neither elevated nor diminished by the shift, simply present. As the toast concluded and applause echoed once more, Alexander leaned toward her and asked quietly whether she would like to head out soon, and she nodded, knowing that departure at the right moment carries more power than lingering for validation. And as they turned toward the exit together, Jason remained among familiar faces that suddenly felt less certain, watching them move toward the doors with a realization settling in that composure, once dismissed as fragility, had become the quiet force that reshaped the entire evening. The exit doors opened with a muted click, and as Emily and Alexander stepped into the corridor outside the ballroom, the noise of the reunion softened into a distant echo of laughter and glassware. As though the evening had already begun to fold itself into memory, the hallway lights were warmer, less theatrical, reflecting gently against polished marble floors, and their footsteps moved in quiet rhythm toward the elevators at the far end. Halfway down the corridor, the doors behind them opened again, and this time Jason's voice carried without a microphone, calling Emily's name with a tone that tried to balance composure and urgency. She stopped, not abruptly, but with deliberate calm, and turned to face him while Alexander remained beside her, neither stepping forward nor retreating, simply present. Jason approached with measured steps, his jacket unbuttoned now, the earlier polish slightly unsettled, and he said he had not expected things to unfold the way they did tonight, that he might have underestimated her, the words carefully arranged to sound reflective rather than regretful. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, and when he mentioned how far she had come, how impressive it all was, she replied softly that growth is rarely loud when it is real, and that success does not need an audience to validate it. Jason glanced briefly at Alexander before admitting that the market had been unpredictable lately, that leadership required difficult choices, and for a moment his voice lost its earlier certainty. Alexander responded evenly that markets reward integrity over time, and that foundations built with respect tend to outlast those built on image, and the statement hung in the air not as criticism but as principle. A quiet pause settled among them, long enough for Jason to understand that this was not a confrontation he could win with charm or rhetoric. He looked at Emily once more, perhaps searching for the version of her who once sought his approval, but what he found instead was steadiness, and in that steadiness there was no bitterness, no triumph, only clarity. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, doors sliding open to reveal mirrored walls that reflected all three figures for a brief second, equal in height, different in posture. Emily stepped inside first, Alexander following beside her, and before the doors closed she met Jason's gaze one final time, not to prove anything, not to diminish him, but to acknowledge that the story he once narrated no longer defined her. The doors slid shut smoothly, sealing the moment without drama, and as the elevator descended floor by floor toward the quiet street below, the reunion above continued without them, while in the mirrored reflection Emily saw not the woman who had been described as unable to endure pressure, but someone who had mastered it without ever raising her voice. The elevator doors opened to the quiet elegance of the lobby, where polished stone floors reflected soft golden lighting and a doorman in a tailored coat held the glass entrance steady against the cool night air. Outside, the city moved with its usual rhythm, taxis gliding past in steady lines, traffic lights shifting from red to green, and a black sedan waiting at the curb with headlights glowing patiently. Emily stepped onto the sidewalk first, the crisp air brushing against her face as though clearing the last trace of the evening from her skin, and Alexander joined her beside the car without speaking, allowing the silence to remain companionable rather than heavy. Above them, 30 floors up, the reunion continued under crystal chandeliers, but down here the street felt real, grounded, untouched by applause or whispered speculation. The driver opened the rear door, and before entering Emily glanced back at the towering hotel windows, small squares of light against the dark sky, knowing that somewhere behind one of them Jason still stood among familiar faces, perhaps replaying conversations, perhaps reassessing assumptions, but no longer directing the narrative. She did not feel anger, nor triumph, only a steady sense of alignment, as though something that had once been mismeasured had finally corrected itself. Alexander asked quietly whether she felt at peace, and she answered that peace does not arrive loudly. It settles in when there is nothing left to prove. The car door closed with a soft, decisive sound, sealing them inside a space removed from scrutiny, and as the sedan pulled away from the curb, the city lights streaked gently across the windows like moving constellations. She rested her hand over Alexander's, not for reassurance but in acknowledgement of partnership, and he squeezed back lightly, understanding without explanation that tonight had never been about spectacle. It had been about standing in the same room where she was once reduced to a footnote and realizing that she no longer fit inside that margin. Traffic thinned as they moved toward the highway, the skyline receding in the rearview mirror, and Emily allowed herself one final thought of the ballroom above, not with resentment but with clarity. She had not returned to reclaim what was lost, nor to rewrite history, but to confirm that her worth had never depended on anyone else's version of events. And as the car merged smoothly into the flow of headlights stretching across the interstate, she understood that the most powerful victories are the ones that require no announcement, because she did not win him back, she won herself. The highway stretched ahead in long silver lines beneath the glow of overhead lamps, and the steady hum of the engine filled the quiet space inside the car as the city skyline gradually dissolved into distant points of light. Emily watched the reflection of passing headlights slide across the window, each one appearing briefly before disappearing behind them, and she realized that the evening felt exactly the same, visible for a moment, then already receding. Alexander loosened his tie slightly, not out of discomfort but habit, and asked whether she would prefer to stop for coffee before heading home, giving her the option of prolonging the night or closing it cleanly. She considered the question for a few seconds, then said she would rather go home, because sometimes the strongest statement is choosing rest over reflection. The driver adjusted lanes smoothly, merging onto the interstate where traffic thinned into quiet intervals, and the rhythm of tires against pavement settled into something almost meditative. Emily leaned back against the seat and allowed herself to replay the earlier hours, not the laughter or the applause, but the small details that mattered, the way Jason's confidence shifted when recognition dawned, the way the room recalibrated without confrontation, the way silence carried more authority than any rebuttal could have. She did not feel satisfaction in his discomfort, only clarity in her own growth, and that distinction felt important. Alexander glanced at her with quiet attentiveness and said he admired how she handled the evening, how she never corrected anyone publicly, how she let reality speak for itself, and she responded that dignity does not need volume, it needs consistency, something she had learned slowly, one decision at a time. The car exited onto a quieter boulevard lined with trees whose branches cast soft shadows beneath streetlights, and familiar buildings began to appear, the bookstore on the corner that stayed open late, the small Italian restaurant they favored on weekends, ordinary landmarks that grounded the night in everyday life. Emily understood then that the true measure of success was not the ballroom or the headlines, but the calm she felt returning to a place built on mutual respect. As the sedan turned into their neighborhood and slowed near the driveway, she exhaled gently, aware that the reunion had closed a chapter without reopening old wounds, and when the car came to a smooth stop, she stepped out beneath a sky scattered with quiet stars, knowing that the most meaningful transformations are rarely dramatic, they are simply undeniable. The front door closed behind them with a quiet certainty that felt different from the heavy doors of the hotel ballroom, and the house welcomed them with the soft glow of recessed lights and the faint scent of cedar from the polished floors. Emily slipped off her heels near the entryway, placing them neatly beside the console table, and for a moment she simply stood there, absorbing the stillness, the absence of expectation, the quiet that did not demand performance. Alexander set his keys down in a shallow ceramic bowl and loosened his cufflinks, moving with the ease of someone accustomed to coming home rather than arriving somewhere. Outside, the neighborhood rested beneath a canopy of mature oak trees, the occasional passing car barely audible beyond the double-pane windows, and inside the space felt grounded, intentional, built over time rather than assembled for display. Emily walked toward the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, the sound of it filling the crystal clear and uncomplicated, and as she took a slow sip she thought about how different this silence felt compared to the silence she once endured years ago in a smaller apartment 300 miles away, when uncertainty pressed against her like an unanswered question. Tonight there was no uncertainty, only completion. Alexander joined her at the counter and asked if she regretted going, and she shook her head gently, explaining that some rooms must be re-entered not to relive them but to release them. And he nodded, understanding that the reunion had never been about nostalgia but about confirmation. She moved toward the living room where framed photographs lined a shelf, images from charity events, quiet vacations, ordinary Sundays, snapshots that reflected consistency rather than spectacle, and she paused briefly at one taken during the groundbreaking ceremony for the scholarship wing, remembering how she had insisted the funds remain anonymous at first because impact mattered more than recognition. Alexander approached from behind and wrapped an arm lightly around her shoulders, not possessive, not protective, simply connected, and he said that the evening revealed more about character than success ever could. She rested her hand over his and replied that character is what remains when applause fades. The clock above the fireplace ticked steadily toward midnight, marking the end of a day that had begun like any other yet closed a chapter she had once believed would linger unfinished. As she dimmed the lights and prepared to head upstairs, Emily felt no urge to check her phone, no curiosity about messages from former classmates, because the only validation she needed was already present in the calm rhythm of her own breath, and in that calm she understood that true elevation is not about standing above someone else, but about standing firmly within yourself. Morning arrived gently, not with urgency but with pale sunlight filtering through linen curtains and settling across the hardwood floors in soft gold patterns. Emily woke before the alarm, the quiet of the house wrapping around her like something earned rather than borrowed, and for a moment she remained still, listening to the steady rhythm of her own breathing, aware that the weight she once carried in 2 rooms no longer followed her home. Beside her, Alexander stirred slightly, the early light tracing calm lines across his face, and she felt the simple reassurance of partnership that did not demand performance. Downstairs, the coffee maker hummed to life on its programmed schedule, and the familiar aroma drifted upward, grounding the new day in routine. She rose and walked to the window, parting the curtains just enough to see the street below where joggers moved at an unhurried pace and a neighbor waved while collecting the morning newspaper. Ordinary gestures that felt far more significant than any applause beneath chandeliers. She thought briefly of the reunion, not with tension but with clarity, recognizing that what had once felt like an open loop had quietly closed without confrontation. She had walked into a room where her story had been simplified and walked out without defending it, because her life no longer required explanation. Alexander joined her at the window and asked what she was thinking, and she replied that peace feels different when it is chosen rather than negotiated. He smiled softly and said that some chapters end not with arguments but with understanding, and she nodded, knowing that the most decisive moments rarely echo. Downstairs, she poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the kitchen island, sunlight catching the thin line of steam rising into the air, and as they sat together in comfortable silence she understood that the evening had not been about proving worth to someone who once doubted it, but about confirming it to herself. The phone remained untouched on the counter, notifications blinking unseen, because there was nothing left to monitor or measure. Outside, the day expanded in quiet promise, another 24 hours shaped not by comparison but by intention, and as she looked across the table at the life she had built through patience and resolve, she realized that dignity does not shout, it glows, steady and unmistakable, and in that steady glow she had found something far greater than revenge. She had found herself.